Hi, Acadiana. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. It is a Friday, kind of a gray one out there and very muggy. Of course, believe it or not, here we are on November the 8th, and we have a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. And for a while, it was a major hurricane overnight, but it seems like it's starting to get into that weakening process. Winds are still 110 miles per hour, so it's right there on the borderline Category 2, Category 3. But it's a very compact hurricane, and those hurricane force winds only go out about 20 miles, and the tropical storm force winds only go out about 80 miles at the most from the center of circulation. So with some pressure gradients tightening up from low pressure out to the west and a high pressure ridge to the east, we are seeing a little bit more of a breeze, and we're going to get a stronger onshore flow. So there will be some minor effects in the offshore waters as well as the coastal sections, and we'll talk about that coming up in just a couple of minutes. But good to be live here again on this midday show. Thank you for bearing with me with those two morning and afternoon shows as I was able to go work at the Southwest Louisiana Swim League's high school district championships. We had 1A, 2A on Tuesday. 3A, 4A was on Wednesday. We had the 5A competition yesterday, and then tomorrow we get the top 16. So it's kind of a busy week for me, but I like being there for all those high school kids as the swimming season comes to a close. And good luck to everybody who made those state times who are going to be heading to that meet coming up in a couple of weeks. 80 degrees right now here in Lafayette, a lot of cloud cover, and the dew point is at 72. So it does feel a lot more like summer. It doesn't feel like November at all with those dew points in the 70s. Heat index 84 degrees. Winds are currently out of the east-northeast at 5, and the pressure is down to 29.94. Now, we do have a couple of showers that are out there, very light showers. They were a little heavier there down into Iberia and St. Mary a little over an hour ago, but as they lift inland, they are starting to kind of fizzle out. But there might be enough energy in the atmosphere later this afternoon to get a couple of isolated thunderstorms going. So keep that in mind. I'm going to keep that rain chance here at about 40% for the rest of the day. And you can see that we've got those gray skies across Acadiana this afternoon. Traffic moving along okay. Doesn't look like there's too much rain on the I-10 between Lafayette and over toward the Basin Bridge. So everything all right out there. Drive carefully over the weekend. And welcome to a lot of our friends Raging Cajuns that have come into town for homecoming, and all of us Raging Cajun fans who live right here in Acadiana. I know big football game coming up tomorrow afternoon, 4 o'clock. Tailgating and the football game probably going to be affected by some rain, and I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But the wide open tropical satellite, of course, you can see Hurricane Rafael in the Gulf of Mexico, and then we've got also a little bit of disturbed weather north of Puerto Rico that has a very slight chance for development. And then farther down the road, those models are starting to indicate more that Central American gyre that has spun up several of these tropical systems toward the latter part of the hurricane season might stay active going into the next couple of weeks. But there's your tropical weather outlook showing Hurricane Rafael and also that very slight chance for development there northwest of Puerto Rico and up through the Bahamas here over the next several days. Did want to bring to your attention, though, that even though we're not going to see any major effects from Hurricane Rafael, it is going to be throwing the water and deep southerly flow coming in over the next several days. So we are going to see some coastal flooding possible. So a coastal flood advisory has been posted for our Acadiana parishes and even going down along the upper Texas coast. And for boaters this weekend, I don't think you're going to have a very good time as the winds and the seas are going to be quite high. And even in our nearshore waters, we're already seeing 3 to 5 foot seas with those winds gusting as high as 25 knots. So we've got small craft advisories posted out there. And then way out in the Gulf of Mexico, we've got those tropical storm and hurricane warnings that are there. So you might be rocking a little bit on some of the platforms if you're doing some work out there, and probably some very large rolling waves. Again, if you see something cool out there, I'd love to see a picture. Share that with me on my social media pages. So let's go to the different players that will work with Hurricane Rafael, and one in particular is a low pressure area that's out here to the west, and that has been kind of cut off in the upper levels over the last several days, but it's finally going to open up and eject kind of off toward the northeast, and that should tend to pull Rafael a little bit farther toward the north. But at the same time, you got a pretty big ridge of high pressure that's over here that's kind of back building a little bit. So that in turn would shove Rafael back down to the south. So that's why you're starting to see these weird computer models of kind of a meander here over the middle part of the Gulf, or maybe a loop coming up. So it really is going to be the battle between the low and the high out here to the east. So when both of them are kind of having equal pressure on both with the system, it just doesn't turn anywhere. So that's why we're starting to see some of these models with these weird loop-de-loop type of tracks here. So we'll watch that low. We still think that's going to eject off to the east, but also we think that ridge off to the, or to the west rather, the ridge off to the east is probably going to strengthen. But all at the same time, the hurricane should be moving into an area that is a lot less favorable for development. Now, it's kind of been an overperformer here based on the current situation that's out there, but last night it did run over kind of a warm eddy of water, and that's why we saw a little bit of strengthening overnight. But now it seems like it's starting to catch some of that drier air. It's also going to be seeing a bit more wind shear. Wind shear is going to be quite high over the western and northern part of the Gulf of Mexico. So we are anticipating weakening of this storm as it goes through the rest of the weekend. And there's the floater satellite. And again, it is a little bit unusual not only to see a hurricane of this magnitude in the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico, but also the fact that we have no tropical storm warnings or hurricane warnings anywhere around the Gulf of Mexico. And that's why we're only getting the updates every 6 hours now. And it does put people on edge. And sometimes I'm wondering too, I've watched all the Facebook messages and I try to answer everybody as much as possible. And I know there's a lot of questions, but with this kind of stalling out here, it's kind of weird how folks are. In the past, they tell meteorologists kind of freak out a little bit too much and they kind of overblow a lot of these tropical systems. But now it seems like most of us meteorologists aren't freaking out quite as much, but it's almost like some of the commenters that I'm seeing on Facebook wish that we were freaking out a little bit more. But that is not the case because we really don't expect any impacts from this, not only because it's most likely going to be staying over the water, but also because there's a really good chance that it's going to be weakening. So the National Hurricane Center's cone is kind of hard to understand here because it's actually forecasting a bit of a loop. And you have to remember that each one of those points that is on the 5-day forecast, there's a margin of error, but it's a circle. But then if the storm was going in more of a straight line, you'd have a smaller circle at 12 hours, a little bit larger circle of error at 24, and so on and so on and so forth. And then what you do is you kind of take all those circles and you draw a cone around it. Well, you can see where the tropical depression status is on Wednesday, it looks like on this particular map, and you see that large circle. That large circle is the margin of error at 120 hours or 5 days out. And all of the others are little circles too, but because it's looping around, it makes it a funny looking shape and you don't get that classic cone that you would normally see with hurricane forecasting. And here's part of the reason, and you've got these tracks. Several of them were turning toward Louisiana earlier in the week, and then we had some kind of shifting back toward the south, toward the mid part of the week. And now, because there's this balance between low pressure to the west and high pressure to the east, it's either going to stall or it's going to meander a little bit or perhaps do a loop. And that happens sometimes with these tropical systems. It's not that unusual. We've seen a number of systems kind of loop around themselves. But this one, if it does it based on some of the models that we're looking at here, this would be a very, very tight loop around itself here between now and the early part of next week. Intensity models too, right now we're still at that borderline category 2, category 3, but you can see here, even going out 24 hours, almost all of the models drop it below category 2 and several go into tropical storm. And then by the time you get out to 2 days, which is the 48 hour, that's right in here, you can also see that you've got most of the models dropping to tropical storm. And then when you get to 3 days, just about all of them are into tropical storm, and 4 days it continues to weaken. So the conditions in the western, northern, and southern part of the Gulf of Mexico are really kind of hostile for tropical systems. So even if it were to turn toward the north, toward Louisiana, it would probably get ripped apart. And the best we would see would be a tropical depression or a weak tropical storm. Same thing if it goes west toward Texas or if it goes south toward Mexico. Pretty much any direction going west is probably going to see some weakening. Also, remember the tropical storm force winds are fairly tight around the center of circulation. Most of the radius is about 60 to 80 miles, depending on which direction you go. And the hurricane force winds only go out 20 miles. But you get that wind to really start to churn things up in the Gulf of Mexico, so those rolling waves, those rougher seas can go out a lot farther from the center of the system. So along the Louisiana coastline, the Texas coastline, and then getting down into Mexico as well, there's going to be some rip currents. There's going to be a lot of rough seas there, and there could be some coastal erosion with those bigger waves. And that's because it's going to be sticking around here for a few days. So let's start with the hurricane-specific models. And the HWRF and the HAFS models really are a little bit different from the global models because they're seriously like zoning in just on the hurricane itself. And you can see the HWRF shows kind of that little bit of a meander and then kind of dropping off toward the south as we get into Tuesday and Wednesday, and then complete dissipation as it moves a little bit farther toward the south. The HWRF model was the first one to really kind of show this westerly then southwesterly track. And the HAFS model is now basically doing the exact same thing. It has it kind of meander over the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico and then a slight track toward the south. But I did want to go back to the HWRF and watch these last few frames. Kind of pay attention there south of Cuba, because the HWRF is showing maybe another low trying to develop in that Central American gyre. And we've talked about these extended forecasts about the possibility of keeping hurricane season going here into the third, maybe second, third, and fourth week of November. But the HAFS model doesn't quite have as deep as a low. But when we get into the global models, you're going to see some interesting stuff. So we've been going out 5 days on the global model. I'm going to go ahead and stretch it back out to 10 days because you can see how Rafael just kind of loops around the Gulf and drops down to the south. But then look what happens there off the coast of Nicaragua. You get a pretty decent sized storm trying to develop, and the last two model runs of the GFS have been indicating this. So we've been talking about Sebastien maybe developing in that area that was shaded in yellow north of Puerto Rico going over toward the Bahamas, but none of the models really are turned on by that particular area. They seem a little bit farther down the road to be talking about something developing again over the western part of the Caribbean Sea. Wouldn't that be something? The Euro model, watch Rafael, kind of spins around there, kind of wobbles for a while, maybe kind of tracks northward, and then it starts to turn back to the south again, and it weakens rapidly. In fact, the Euro model has it completely dissipating. And again, if you look off toward the southeast, you get some moisture building in the western part of the Caribbean, but unlike the GFS, it does not seem to be working with anything new over the western part of the Caribbean Sea. So we'll move on to the Canadian. Again, very similar to the first two models on Rafael, just kind of a wobble around in a circle and then kind of dissipating as it moves toward the Mexican coast. And then if you look there in the Western Caribbean, you got a little bit of a ripple of low pressure there in those final frames going out 10 days. So it might be starting to bite on what the GFS is, but you really don't get too excited about what's going to be happening in the Western Caribbean until we have all of the global models kind of indicating something out there. ICON doesn't go quite as far out as the other three models. It only goes out 7 days, but it brings it a little bit closer, Rafael rather, closer to the coast, and then again kind of has it meander and eventually wash out. And then there in those last few frames, you do see a little bit of a low trying to develop there over the western part of the Caribbean. So all four of the models really are showing just kind of a circulation and kind of a wobble around, a wandering of Rafael in the Gulf of Mexico. But I've got two models that are calling for a new tropical system to develop within the next 10 days. So let's just go out to late Sunday, early Monday, just to kind of give you a position of where we think Rafael will be and its intensity. GFS still has it over the central part of the Gulf of Mexico, 10:05 on the pressure. That's probably a weak tropical storm or a tropical depression. The Euro model looks like that's 10:06 on there. Again, very similar to the GFS, kind of flip back and forth there. You can see that they're pretty much in agreement. Canadian model, a little bit deeper on the low, keeping it again over the central part of the Gulf of Mexico. Let's go through all three. There's the GFS, there's the Euro, and there's the Canadian. So all three of them are pretty much in agreement here for the next 3 days. And the icon model is a little bit closer to the Louisiana coast, but again, it's still kind of in the neighborhood of where the GFS, the Euro, the Canadian, and there's the icon right there. So there's the comparison between the four models on where it would be. And as far as the pressure, you got a 1005, looks like a 1006. Let's see, what is that one there? That one's a little bit harder to read. That one's 1003. And then the icon has a 1007. So again, you're going to see that pressure coming up, which means a weakening tropical system. And most likely, if anything, by the time we get into the end of the weekend is out there, it's probably going to be a tropical storm or a tropical depression. Now remember, overnight we had some strengthening. We got this up to 120 again. The water temperatures out in the Gulf of Mexico are warm, but they're not extreme like they were during the months of July and August, where some of those Celsius temperatures where we're running 28, 29, even 30 degrees Celsius. So we've dropped off. These water temperatures here are closer to 80 to 82 degrees rather than 88 to 90 like they were in the middle part of the summer. But there was that little eddy of warm water right in here in the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico. So that's where we saw the strengthening happen last night. And it's now drifting off toward the west. So the heat potential here over the western part of the Gulf of Mexico is not nearly as high. So as a tropical system goes over, even though the water temperatures on the surface are over 80 degrees, those water temperatures are a bit cooler below the surface. So as things start to churn around with the tropical system out there, it starts to pull up some colder water. And because it's expected to go stationary or just kind of meander kind of in the same area, it would tend to pull up quite a bit of colder water, and that colder water is one of the reasons why we're expecting the system to really lose its strength here over the next several days. Wind shear also is going to be an issue when it comes to Rafael. You can see that there's a lot of wind shear over the northern Gulf Coast, and that extends south of the Rio Grande Valley as well. And then as we get into early next week, even though the GFS has it lifting a little bit farther to the north, it would be running into all that wind shear. And then you're going to have quick tearing apart of that tropical system. So that is the reason why we think it's going to continue to weaken. And at this point, it looks like that ridge of high pressure that's over the Atlantic is going to win the battle. And as it weakens, it's not going to be influenced as much by the trough out in the west. So it would eventually shove its way off toward the south. But it is pretty interesting that we've got those extended 10-day models, a couple of them now starting to fire up something else over the western part of the Caribbean, which would fall right in line with the global tropics hazard outlook. So week 2 starts on the 13th. That's a week from Tuesday. Week 3 would be 2 weeks from Tuesday. We'll get another update for this one coming up next week, but it's still indicating some above normal activity possibly over the western Caribbean, the western Atlantic near the Bahamas, going all the way into almost Thanksgiving, which, believe it or not, is a little bit unusual because you don't normally see a lot of tropical systems during the month of November. In the last 5 years, I think we had a couple of years where we had 3, but none of them made them into their way into the Gulf of Mexico, except for I think in the year 2020 when we had Hurricane Eta that developed in the Caribbean, then it kind of worked over toward Cuba, then worked westward through the Florida Keys, and then came back onshore in the northern part of Florida there toward the mid and latter part of November. So unusual, not unheard of, but it looks like hurricane season wants to keep going for at least another couple of weeks. And it would fall in line too with where our tropical systems normally would develop and move during the month of November. Again, a lot of that has to do with that Central American gyre. And if you're not familiar with that, look in the video description below, and there's a link for the Central American gyre. There's a whole bunch of other links that are down there too that you can click around with. So that's one of the things that I like about doing all of this weather on YouTube, is because I can share with you all of the links that I'm using, and you can look at all of the products that I'm able to use right here in the shows each and every day. So you can go back and look, and it's all free. You can go back and look at all that stuff, and it really helps to help you understand how weather works, how tropical weather works, and even how your daily forecast works. So click on some of those links down below and just kind of play around and have fun with it. But at this point, I'm not too concerned about Rafael having any effects on Acadiana. We'll probably see some extra showers, but a lot of that is going to be from a front coming in from the west. I don't think Rafael is going to be strengthening anymore. It's just going to be meandering out in the central part of the Gulf of Mexico. And fortunately, the winds are pretty compact right around the center. It'll expand a little bit as the system kind of dies off, but we won't be talking about hurricane force winds anywhere close to the Louisiana coastline. So it looks like we continue our November streak of no hurricanes hitting the coast of Louisiana during the month of November. Great news there. Well, I hope you enjoy these midday broadcasts. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on those notifications. That way, when you know when the next Acadiana Weather Today or Let's Talk Tropics drops here on YouTube. And don't forget, you can hear my forecast each and every day on Big 102.1, Planet Radio 106.7, and Freedom 95.1. And in between all these broadcasts, please follow my social media pages, both on Facebook and X. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy homecoming. Go Raging Cajuns. I will see you on Monday. Have a great weekend.